15. So we are getting more and more busy. So what a day, isn't it? I'm sure that you are all looking forward to change your shoes, put a more casual dressing, and prepare for dinner tonight. And just as a little bit of a housekeeping for those that were here on time, you will know that the bus will pick us up at 7 o'clock as yesterday. So in the front of the hotel, the buses will pick us up, and I think it will be like a 20-minute ride to the restaurant. And as usual, great food is waiting for us. And make sure you go comfortable. It's a casual occasion, not a formal at all. So I think it's I'm just stuffing sausages as usual to make sure we get more audience in the room, because the topic that is coming up has to do with a very new situation that in the gemological world we have been facing, that is the stability of the color of some corundum gem varieties. And that's pretty much a very, very important issue regarding consumer confidence and how to deal with those issues. We do know that some gemstones, they are not stable, or some colors, they might not be stable under certain conditions. This is a different game, as we will learn in a few minutes. Well, our next speaker, he's a geologist with a PhD by Stanford University. He's also, of course, a gemologist. Aaron Palke, he's a senior research scientist at the Gemological Institute of America, and he became involved with the GIA when he was at the postdoctoral research program at the institute in Carlsbad. He works directly with an icon of our gemological world, Shane McClure, that most of you know. If you read the Gems and Gemology, the magazine, for sure you know Shane's contributions to gemology for decades. So he's a privileged gemologist that works really close to Shane. And Aaron has been working at the color gemstone department at the laboratory in Carlsbad. And the topic of his talk is, as I've announced, something that has a lot to do with color stability in a few gem varieties of corundum. Big warm welcome to Aaron Palke, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. I'll have to get them to update my photo. That one doesn't really look like me at all. I think that was like 10 years old. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for coming by. It's late in the day. I hope I keep you on your toes and keep you all interested. I'm going to be talking about color instability in sapphires. This is a big topic. It's a pretty hot topic right now. We all know there's been several reports recently about stones coming out of Sri Lanka specifically that have been irradiated artificially, and their color changes, and we don't know exactly what the real color is, and so it's causing a big ruckus in the market. I'm going to try to go over some of the details. I think what I hope you all can take from this at the end is to have some clues about what to look for and some idea of how to test for color instability, and potentially to test in your offices and your homes, how to test for the true color of the stone, and then also to address kind of this nebulous question of what is the actual true color of a color unstable sapphire. So in the laboratory, one of the big challenges for us in terms of color instability is padparadscha. This is really the main thing we're concerned about in the lab for color unstable sapphires. So what is a padparadscha? Padparadscha is a pinkish orange to orangey pink sapphire, kind of with pastel tones, low to medium saturation. They're exceptionally rare, highly valued. The problem is you can create these artificially in some cases, and we're going to show you what happens there. So a padparadscha sapphire is meant to evoke an image like this, right? So it's named after this lotus blossom, this orangey pink to pinkish orange lotus blossom. Very romantic idea to have your sapphire associated with a lotus blossom is kind of very romantic and beautiful to think of your sapphire as being related to this lotus flower. What a padparadscha is not meant to evoke is an image like this. So this is a fellow in a nuclear reactor facility. He's lowering down some stones into this experimental reactor to be artificially irradiated. So what he's doing is he's taking a sapphire like this, nice pink sapphire, lowering it down into the nuclear reactor, and then it comes out looking something like this. And so this actually is a stone that we had irradiated artificially. So this was only maybe about a month or two ago. We sent some stones off to a facility in Ohio to be electron irradiated. This was the original color of the sapphire. And then after electron beam radiation, it turned basically into a ruby. So this was an intense, extreme change in color from this sapphire. The other challenge with this is that, so it's not always easy to get into these facilities. Not everyone has access to an electron beam irradiation facility in Ohio, but what you do have probably is a long-wave UV torch. So stones like this that react to this kind of treatment almost always also react to a simple irradiation with a UV torch. You might have like a little handheld UV torch in your desk. You can hit a stone like this for about 20 minutes and get a pretty significant change in color. It's not as extreme as it was with that electron beam irradiation, but it's still pretty significant. Now, we've all seen the reports. So only a few months ago, CIBJO, AGTA, and ICA jointly addressed this issue of color instability in Sri Lankan sapphires and rubies. But it's not just that. Only a few years ago, we had this issue with potential rubies being irradiated. So it was brought to news that some stones, some rubies were being irradiated to kind of enhance that color, get a deeper, more vivid ruby red color out of them. And then a few years before that, we saw pink sapphires, especially from Madagascar. There was a new find of pink sapphires from Madagascar that people realized they could juice up with long-wave UV torches and change the color from pink to a padparadscha-like color. And here's a general idea. So the same basic phenomenon is happening in all of these color unstable sapphires. It's always the same no matter what the base color is, but you can start from a colorless sapphire like this, and then if you irradiate a colorless sapphire like this, you might get this nice kind of orangey yellow-orange color from gamma irradiation, for instance. I would make the point, though, that this is really not something new. This is a report from Crowning Shield in 1969 in the Gemtrade Lab News in New York. This was in Gems and Gemology. And he wrote about X-ray bombarded sapphires. So he was talking about sapphires. They had this specific case where a jeweler took a yellow sapphire and he used a little too much heat with the torch, and he overheated the sapphire and turned it colorless. And so they had this great idea. They said, let's irradiate the sapphire to try to get that yellow back. So they irradiated it with X-rays, and then they realized when they irradiated it, they had put too much yellow color back into the sapphire. So now it was another wrong color. And what they ended up doing over the weekend of a long 4th of July weekend, they taped the sapphire to a window in the New York lab. And when they came back over the long weekend, they found that the color was the way it should be, the way the original jeweler had remembered that stone before he overheated it. But even before that, so that was 1969. There's also a book from Smith in 1949 where he mentioned that yellow sapphires could lose their color after being heated, and that kind of immersing them in radium salts, so kind of a form of radiation, could get that color back, or could actually even deepen that color. So this has been going on for a long time. It's not only that we've just learned about this in the last couple of years, we've known about this for decades, for probably over 100 years by now. So what actually is irradiation treatment? There's kind of I'm going to split this up into kind of two different paths. There's the high energy sources, the things most of us don't really have access to. So these are things like X-rays, high energy X-rays, gamma rays, electron beams. These kind of require access to some kind of high-tech facility like a particle accelerator, nuclear medical facilities, so on and so forth. You usually get a much stronger reaction, though. If you use these high energy sources, you'll get a much deeper color after you irradiate them with these high energy sources. The kind of big concern for us in the lab, at least, is these lower energy sources, because almost anybody has access to this. You can get a long-wave UV torch for $100 on the internet, and you can start juicing up your pink sapphires, potentially creating unstable padparadscha-like colors. I'm sorry, that was my slide there. This is the kind of long-wave UV torch we use in the lab. It's a little handheld unit made by Convoy. Super easy to use, intense light source. This is one of the things I use actually a lot in the experiments that I've been doing with these color unstable sapphires. This is the exact torch that I use in most cases. So the basic principle is you add yellow or orange color. it doesn't really vary much from that. You can start from different base colors. So if you start from a colorless sapphire, you're going to get a yellow or an orange sapphire. If you start from a pink sapphire, you're going to get a padparadscha-like color or potentially a ruby if you get enough of this unstable coloration in there. Now, the nice thing about this, though, is that this is unstable. I've been saying the same thing for this whole talk. It's an unstable coloration in sapphires. I'm going to talk a little bit about stability of different colored stone treatments. So things like heat treatment are very stable. So if you take your sapphire, heat it in the furnace to turn it blue, that blue color is going to stay there for basically the whole time you own the stone and the whole time anybody owns the stone after you, unless you do something really weird and extreme with that stone. Things like clarity enhancement, though, Andy talked about this with the rubies from Mogok. These oils and resins are not very stable in many cases. Resins tend to be more stable, oil is a little less stable. Your oils can leak out of fractures, but for the most part, there's kind of a wide range of stability here. Now with color unstable, with radiation in particular, this also kind of covers a wide gamut of stability. So things like a lot of the radiated stones we think about, like topaz, rubellite, diamonds, these are actually relatively stable. They're quite stable under ordinary conditions. If you heated up your rubellite that had been irradiated, it's going to lose some color, but there's no reason why you would put it in a furnace in the first place. So for the most part, most irradiated colored stones are going to hold their color basically the entire time you own the stone. On the other end of things, though, there are some radiation treatments that are extremely unstable. This is a kind of unusual, very rare scapolite that's colorless under ordinary conditions. You can juice it up with a long-wave UV irradiation and turn it to this nice blue color, but it apparently only lasts for about a few seconds. This photo was taken by Shane McClure, who Rui mentioned. I don't know exactly how he took the photo, if that color only lasts for like 3 seconds, but he somehow managed to get it. He's pretty good with photography and that sort of stuff. Now, getting back to the topic at hand, though, sapphires. It's unstable color, yes, but in some conditions, the color can actually be quite stable. That artificial color that is introduced by irradiation can be quite stable. So this is a stone one of my colleagues in Bangkok, May, went to. There's an experimental radiation facility in Bangkok that does collaborations with gem people, and they let us into their facility to do some gamma irradiation experiments. This was a sapphire we gamma irradiated. It was initially kind of a very pale yellow color. I'll show you the original color on the next slide. But right after we got it back from the facility, it turned this nice kind of orangey yellow color. We put it in a dark place for about a month, and it kept most of its color. You can see a little bit of that color was lost. It's a little lighter now than it was originally, but it's still got a lot of that artificial color in there. And this is kind of a big problem, right? Because after a month, if the stone hasn't been exposed to a lot of white light, and I'll get to why that's important in a few slides, but if you've been keeping the stone mostly in the dark, not exposed to a lot of white light, that artificial color could stay in the stone. It could pass through several hands and still have a lot of that artificial color from the irradiation treatment in it. Now, the nice thing, though, is that it's not stable in all conditions. So especially with the exposure to intense white light, this artificial coloration from the irradiation treatment is quite unstable. So this is what we call our stability test. And so in the laboratory, we do this routinely, especially with padparadscha sapphires, to make sure that that padparadscha color is actually the stable or the true color of the stone. We'll expose it to intense white light from a halogen bulb for about 6 hours. And if you have any of this artificially juiced up color, it's going to lose all that artificial color in a matter of about 6 hours or less. Now, one thing, I'm going to get to this a little bit later too, is that you can even go a little further. So this color on the left is kind of what I would call like the true color of the stone, or it's like the actual color of the stone. This is what you get after doing a stability test with halogen light. If you use an intense LED light, on the other hand, though, you can actually take even more color out of these stones and make it essentially colorless. So we've taken all of this yellow color out of the stone after exposure to intense LED illumination. So this is the basic setup. So in the laboratory, we use just a simple fiber optic box like this. This is a Dolan-Jenner fiber optic box. It's about 150 watts, so it's a very intense light source, but it's got a halogen, or like a warm incandescent light source that we use to do the stability test. And so we'll take the stones in a metal tray, because that fiber optic box puts out a lot of heat, so you need to dissipate the heat by putting it on some kind of metal tray. We'll cover it up so it's not blinding everyone in the lab, and we'll let the stones sit there. So padparadscha is all get this test. They'll sit there for about 6 hours, and we'll do careful Munsell chip comparisons before and after to make sure that there's no change in the color that we see before and after the stability test. Now, the important thing is, this is the slide you should pay attention to, because if you don't get anything else from this talk, the important thing I want to point out is that you can do this at home too. This tensor lamp here, this halogen tensor lamp, you can use something like this very easily to do a stability test on a sapphire that you suspect may have been irradiated either by long-wave UV irradiation or some kind of artificial source like electrons or gamma rays. And so that's shown here. This is that ruby from the original experiment I showed. Again, this was like a pink sapphire originally. We put it into an electron beam source, irradiated it, and up on the top right is the color after I put it on my desk in a little metal tray with my tensor lamp, my halogen tensor lamp. It's like a little gooseneck with a flexible neck, very close to the stone so that all the light's going onto the stone. And we get a significant change in color after only 6 hours under that tensor lamp. So the stability test can be very easily done at home or an office environment. And for comparison, after I did this fading test or the stability test under my desktop halogen bulb, I then put it in the kind of standard stability test we do in the lab, which is under that intense fiber optic light, 150 watts. And the color didn't really change much more. It maybe got a little bit lighter, so we lost a little bit more color from the kind of standard stability test than we did under my desktop halogen bulb. But this is a very easy and practical thing that you can do in your lab, in your home offices, if you suspect you're seeing these irradiated stones. So, like I said, one of the biggest challenges is unstable padparadscha sapphires, or padparadscha-like sapphires. So these are things that we see in the lab. These are some actual examples of stones we've seen where we get the stone in with this image. This is the original color of the stone as submitted. And then on the right is the stone color after the stability test. So you can see all these stones after sitting in that halogen bulb for about 6 hours lost a lot of color. They were originally padparadscha sapphire color, but after the stability test, they went to basically straight pink or maybe purplish pink, and so they no longer qualify as padparachas. So just to make that point more clear, if the color fades out of the padparadscha range, so think orangey pink to pinkish orange after the stability test, it's not a padparadscha. The caveat, though, is that a padparadscha sapphire can have unstable color. So there are some stones that we see that are submitted with a padparadscha color. They're usually more kind of on the orangey side. And then after we put them in the stability test, they end up losing a little bit of color. And we know this because we carefully compare the Munsell chip colors of these stones before and after. We get absorption spectra before and after so that we can carefully compare what's changing in these stones. And there are some stones that lose a little bit of color, but if they still remain in that kind of range of padparadscha color, they still qualify to be padparachas. Now, there are some unusual things that go on as well. So there are some unexpected reactions to the stability test. In most cases, we expect a stone to lose color or to stay the same color after we put it in the stability test. There are some rare cases where we've seen some stones actually gaining color after going into this intense halogen bulb. So there's something really strange going on. We never really understood at first what was going on. This was completely unexpected. We thought it was kind of a completely different phenomenon than the ordinary unstable color padparachas. But when we started looking at it more, we started realizing that this is actually something you can see quite often. This is a really cool example. This was a stone I got from the GI Museum when I was doing some experiments. It's a really beautiful stone. It's like over 6 carats. And I was grabbing stones to kind of irradiate with my long-wave UV torch. And I took the stone, I turned the gem cap over, and it said padparadscha sapphire, which was confusing because this was the color of the stone when I grabbed it from the museum. And that's not a padparadscha. So I suspected, though, that this was one of these cases of these unstable coloration sapphires that would potentially gain color after the stability test. And what I eventually ended up realizing was that this stone must have lost a lot of color by just sitting in the dark. So these unstable padparadscha sapphires, like I said in one of those first slides, they will slowly lose color if you leave them sitting in the dark with no exposure to white light over long periods of time. And so I presume that potentially this stone was originally this color, a padparadscha color, but had been sitting in a drawer for years, if not decades, just sitting around waiting for somebody to come out and take a look at it. And so I put it in the stability test, and it ended up becoming this nice padparadscha-like color. I'm going to posit, or I'm going to suggest that this phenomenon is actually the phenomenon of tenebrescence. So gemologists, we're all familiar with tenebrescence, with things like Hackmanite. most people in the public are probably also familiar with this concept in the form of photochromic glasses. So photochromic glasses are those, where you go outside, they turn into sunglasses, and you come into the inside, and they end up being colorless. So they're colorless glasses. And these unstable color sapphires actually fit this bill quite well. So we've shown that with exposure to UV light, these unstable color sapphires will gain color. You take the UV light away, you expose them to visible light or keep them in the dark for long periods of time, and they'll lose all of that unstable coloration. And so I don't want to get too technical in this talk. This is one of the only instances where I'm going to show spectra. If this is too much in the afternoon, you guys can feel free to look at your phones or something and take a little break. I won't be offended. I'm just going to go through this. I want to just kind of give you an idea of what's going on here. So this is a sapphire that it's one of these sapphires where we had this reverse change in the color. So we put it in the stability test, and it actually gained color rather than losing it. And so it was a stone submitted to the laboratory for an identification report. We ended up wanting to do some experiments on it, so we ended up buying it so that I could expose it to all kinds of different illumination environments, all kinds of different irradiation environments, and see how the stone changed over the course of these different kinds of experiments. And so, if you're not familiar with spectroscopy, what you're seeing here are a bunch of squiggly lines, basically. On the horizontal axis, this is wavelength, so these are the visible wavelengths of light, a little bit of UV in here. And then these spectra on top, these are the different states. So I'm showing here the color of the stone, what I'm calling the ground state, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but that's basically the stone with the least amount of this unstable color possible. All the way up to the UV charge state. This is where I charged it with a UV lamp. It went from basically a purplish pink to a straight orange color. And so one of the reasons we bought this stone was that it actually had this very intense reaction to ultraviolet light, to this long wave ultraviolet light. And so we wanted to study something that had a very intense reaction so we could kind of document and map out everything that was going on with the stone. Now, in between those two extremes is the stone after the stability test. So again, that's after exposure to intense incandescent light. And then after sitting out in the sun, so this was direct cloudless Southern California day in the summer, sunlight for about 1 hour. So, pretty intense daylight for about 1 hour. And so what you're seeing here, these squiggly lines, basically as they go up, that means they're absorbing more of that light. As they go down, that means they're absorbing less of that light. So we have this blue line. This is the ground state, so with the least amount of unstable coloration. The gray line is the UV charge state, so when we charge this stone up the most we possibly could. And you can see there's a lot of difference in the absorption. So we're right here in this kind of blue-green region of the spectrum. We're increasing the amount of absorption, so we're taking blue out of the stone, increasing or kind of favoring this transmission in the orange and red part of the spectrum. And then we have the daylight and the fade tested or the stability tested versions of it right here. Now, the last technical thing I want to point out, the spectrum on the right is very closely matching this spectrum, that kind of blue-green over here. This blue-green is the difference. So that's the blue-green spectrum is what's changing between these different states. So as I charge the stone up, as I decharge the stone, this is the component that I'm adding or subtracting from these different spectra that's creating or destroying color. And basically, without getting too technical, it matches what we call a trapped hole, where this is a defect in the corundum lattice that's associated with magnesium ions that causes this nice yellow-orange coloration. Okay, that's it for spectra for a while. Okay, just to blow this up so you can see kind of more in depth what's happening with these stones. Like I said, this is one of the more extreme examples, and we only UV charge this. We only expose it to long wave UV light. I bet if we put this an electron beam or a gamma ray beam, you'd get a really intense, very dark orange color, just because it changes so much with this long wave UV exposure. But we go from the ground state, that's basically where, like I said, all the unstable color has been taken out of the stone, all the way up to this UV charged state. So purplish pink to basically straight orange, and then everywhere in between. And one of the important points is that you can basically stop anywhere in between if you have the right light source to get you to that point. And so this ground state, like I said, one of the ways you can reach this ground state is by exposure to heat. So like Crowning Shield explained with the jeweler who had overheated his yellow sapphire, he took all the yellow color out of that sapphire and created kind of a colorless sapphire by exposing it to heat. We found that you need about 150 to 200 degrees Celsius really to get that out of your stone, this unstable coloration. I wouldn't recommend doing this as a test because you will end up taking too much of that color out of the stone. You'll get to this ground state, which is not really considered to be kind of like the true or the actual color of the stone. Another way you can get it there is by exposing it to intense LED light. So I'll show this in a couple slides. These LED lights are really not very good for the stability test. You end up taking too much color out of your sapphires. Alternatively, you can leave the stone in the dark for an extended period of time. But to get from like this UV charge state all the way to the ground state, you would probably need several months, if not a year or a couple years, to get from that supercharged state all the way down to this ground state. Like I showed in one of the first slides, you can actually keep quite a bit of color in these artificially radiated sapphires by just leaving them in the dark for about a month. They'll keep quite a bit of that original color. Now, I'm just showing here the kind of the wide gamut or the spectrum of different states you can get with one of these color unstable sapphires. So you can go from the ground state, you can get up to the fully charged state by irradiating it either with UV light, gamma radiation, or you can go from the ground state partially up to the fully charged state by exposure to white light with some kind of a UV component. And that's one of the key points. That's why the LED lights are not very good. You can go from the fully charged state down to the uncharged state by exposure to visible light or by heat, generally around 200 degrees Celsius, or sitting in the dark. Now, the reason that I wouldn't not use an LED light is this. So this is, I'm sorry, I promised you there were no more spectra, but I guess I was wrong. This is actually a different kind of spectrum. This is the emission profile of an incandescent bulb. So this is a warm bulb. It's got a lot of yellow and orange colors. So you see this spectrum kind of going up toward the yellow and the red. That's why this is a warm illumination environment. So all this visible light we're seeing kind of between 400 and about 700 nanometers, this is the magic that happens when we decharge or when we take away that unstable color, that artificial unstable color in these sapphires. However, we do have a little bit of this long wave UV component. And like I mentioned earlier, these color unstable sapphires will actually be charged by this UV component. And so what's actually happening when you expose one of these color unstable sapphires to visible light, to an incandescent light, that visible light decharges the sapphire, and this small component of a UV in there actually partially charges it. It actually kind of partially counteracts the decharging we're getting from that white light or the visible light. Now, daylight does this as well. So daylight has a lot of this visible light. So about 400 to 700 nanometers, we're seeing a lot of light in this range. That's decharging the stones. And so this is why Crowning Shield was able to take that X-ray irradiated yellow sapphire, put it in the window of his office in the New York lab, and the daylight it was exposed to over several days ended up taking most of that artificial color out of the sapphire. But again, there was a small amount of UV in there, and that UV actually counteracted the visible light and actually partially charged that sapphire. So that's why it didn't go completely back to colorless like he'd seen it when he'd overheated the stone, but it was somewhere in between. It was kind of like that original color that the jeweler had remembered the sapphire being. Now, LEDs are really bad for this, and this is why. So this is the emission profile of an LED light. LEDs, commercial LEDs that are just meant for white light applications, don't have any UV component in there. There's no need to add a UV component to a LED light that's just being used for white light illumination. What you do have, though, is a bunch of visible light. So we have a bunch of visible light, and especially with an intense LED light, all that visible light is just going to take out all of that unstable coloration out of the sapphires. There's going to be no UV component to counteract that and bring back a little bit of coloration to these sapphires. And so this is one of the reasons why we probably should not be using LED lights for the stability test. So if you suspect you have an unstable color sapphire, if you have a padparadscha, I would not use an LED light to test this. There's actually probably quite a few padparadschas out there that have the potential to be color unstable, but we just don't know it because we haven't really artificially charged them up or down. If you were to take a lot of ordinary padparadscha sapphires, I suspect you would end up turning them into pink sapphires if you expose them to this kind of a intense LED illumination. This is actually something that's been known for a while. Again, I'm going to mention Shane McClure. Shane McClure mentioned to me that the burners in Sri Lanka, when they're burning yellow sapphires, they know that they have to take the sapphires out of the furnace and then immediately put them out in the sunlight for several hours. So this is the same batch of stones. On the left is the stones right after they were heated. So they took them right out of the furnace, put them on this tray, and set them outside for several hours. And this is right after they were taken out of the furnace. On the right is the stones after several hours of daylight. And you can tell you can't really see the exact same stones before and after, but you can tell there is a significant darkening of the color on the right after these stones were left out in the sunlight. And again, that's because when we heated them, a lot of these sapphires have this unstable, or the potential for unstable coloration, but you heated them up and you've taken that all away. So they're down now in, I call it the ground state. Then after exposure to sunlight, that little bit of UV component in the sunlight actually partially charges these sapphires and creates a little bit of a deeper color. So again, this is kind of the same schematic diagram I've shown before. We have the fully uncharged state, the ground state, which can be achieved by sitting in the dark, heating the stone, or exposing it to LED light. You can expose it to UV or other kinds of irradiation to charge them. And then everywhere in between is kind of like that sweet spot where we kind of expect the color of the stone to be. So this does bring up kind of a somewhat philosophical question, like what is the true color of the stone? So we can achieve any of these states pretty easily with kind of standard illumination environments that you see in a laboratory and a lot of other settings. But if I can get it down to this ground state, is that the actual color of the stone? Or is the color of the stone somewhere in here? To kind of answer that question, I'm going to show this. This is another example that I had in the lab. This was a Sri Lankan sapphire that my colleague Nathan Renfro gave me. We decided to heat it up. We got this like brand new furnace, and we were super excited to heat basically everything and anything in it. So we were just like looking for stones to heat. There was no real purpose to heating the stone except we were just like curious. And so we put it in the furnace. It was originally this kind of pale yellow color. It had been sitting in Nathan's drawer for several months. So it kind of potentially lost a little bit of color. After taking it out of the furnace at 1700 degrees Celsius for 10 hours, it turned into straight colorless sapphire. And so I had this idea. I wanted to kind of test various different conditions of illumination to try to fade the stone and charge the stone in different ways. And the interesting thing I found was that I could basically reverse all of this. I could go from one state to the other, back and forth as many times as I wanted, and I would always end up at the same position, the same color, if I used the exact same conditions under any case. So I could go use my LED light to take it to the ground state, put it in the stability test, hit it with a long wave UV torch, then take it back to LED light, and then do the stability test with my incandescent light again, and I'd always end up at the same point after the stability test. Now, the other interesting thing here is that the color after the stability test, the incandescent light stability test, and the color after exposure to daylight, so on the far right is the stone after exposure to daylight for 4 hours. I just taped it up to a window outside. One thing to be careful with, though, is that many times you can't really tape your stones up to the windows anymore because they have UV filters on them, and you're not going to really get a pure daylight spectrum out of it. But the color after exposure to pure daylight, so being outside, and after the stability test was very similar. And I just have one more spectrum, I'm sorry. This is the absorption spectrum of these two states. So the state after the stability test and after the daylight exposure. You can see they're almost essentially the same, which is reflected in the fact that the color you see is almost essentially the same as well. So what is the true color of one of these color unstable sapphires? So we had a lot of actually internal discussions about this at GIA, and it was kind of a confusing subject to think about for a while, but we came to the conclusion that daylight is kind of like the benchmark, right? So if these stones are going to be worn out in public, these color unstable sapphires and rubies are going to be worn out in the public, worn outside, or worn to the office and exposed to all kinds of white light, they're going to end up being exposed to a lot of white light, and they're going to end up basically with the color that you would see after exposing the stone to daylight. So we consider that to be kind of like the true color of the stone. Now, the colors we call on a GI report are actually the color after the stability test, but we've shown that the color you get from exposure to intense incandescent light is very, very similar to what you get from exposure to daylight. Now, the advantage, though, to incandescent light is that it's consistent. The incandescent light you see from one source from the other is going to be very similar from one place to the other, whereas daylight is actually pretty hard to access. You might have an over cloudy day. You might be from a lab in one hemisphere to a lab in the other hemisphere. From place to place, from time to time, from season to season, your daylight's going to change. And so, because of the consistency of incandescent light illumination, we consider this to be the most accessible, easy standard for making these calls for the color stability test. So the color we report on GI reports is that what we see after the stability test with exposure to intense incandescent light for about 6 hours. All right, so I'm wrapping up with pretty good time actually. Just to kind of summarize, color instability in sapphires is an especially concerning, especially for padparadscha. This is the big challenge we see in the lab. I know there's concerns about rubies and other stones out there in the trade as well. We've not really seen much in terms of rubies that fade after the stability test in the lab. We have been testing on a limited scale, especially orangey red rubies. For a while, we're going into the stability test, and we didn't see any rubies really changing color before and after. I'm sure it's possible, and we saw from that first slide, the first experiment I did, you probably can turn some sapphires into rubies or darken the color or make a more vivid red color in some rubies. But we really haven't seen that in a practical sense so far. So the big challenges with padparadscha, one thing, especially for padparadscha, one thing you can look for potential color instability is that they usually have orange or yellow fluorescence. This very frequently seems to be associated with color instability in padparadschas or padparadscha-like sapphires, color unstable padparadscha-like sapphires. So if you have a long-wave UV torch, you don't want to juice them up too much, but you can quickly look and check the fluorescence with long-wave UV. If you're getting yellow-orange fluorescence out of the stone, there's a fair chance that you have a color unstable sapphire in your hands, and you might want to do a stability test. So like I said, stability test with the incandescent illumination is a standard for making color calls. You can do this at home. That's a really important thing here. You can get a gooseneck tensor lamp. And if you really want to, you can get one of the fiber optic boxes. If you have access to intense daylight, you can take the stone outside for several hours as long as you're watching over it. Any of these options are available and can be used pretty easily by almost anybody to do a stability test for stones that are suspected to have gone artificial irradiation to kind of enhance their colors. And just the final comment, the use of LED lights for stability test is not recommended because they have no UV component in there. You'll take too much color out of your stone and you'll end up at a decharged, desaturated color relative to what we consider to be the actual color of the stone. So with that, that's all I have.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Aaron. A gemology lesson, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very, very much. I will use my MC privileges to ask you a question. And because I was really curious when you said incandescent and daylight and LEDs. Does it have also to do with the correlated color temperature from the 2800 equivalent for incandescent, 6500 in the top daylight equivalent? Did you test different LEDs for that as well?
So we didn't really test different LEDs, but I have emission spectra of different LEDs, and they're all the same. There's no UV component in any of them.
Okay.
So it's not so much about the color temperature; it's more about the balance of visible light to UV light. Yeah. And there's actually very specific wavelengths that do it in each case. The wavelength that decharges the sapphires best is about 450 nanometers, and the wavelength that charges it the best is about 360 nanometers.
Okay.
So it gets kind of complicated, but it's more about the balance of light in those two ranges.
Yes. I mean, I could be here a whole afternoon asking you questions. David Droff, I know you have a question.
I'm just very interested in your thoughts about what actions should be taken to prevent irradiated sapphires, many of which I understand come from Sri Lanka, from entering the market. And can any policing policies be effective?
So I don't think you're going to be able to stop people from going to these facilities and irradiating their sapphires. And like I also showed, you can just do it at home with a long-wave UV torch in many cases. You're not going to get as strong of a reaction, but you in many cases you can get a reaction. So you can't stop people from doing that. I think what could help is more people just being aware of the fact that you can test this, in your office. If you can hold on to the stone for a day or something, you say, well, let me hold on to it. I'm going to put it under this tensor lamp, or a small subset of the samples of the gems you're looking to buy. If you can get away with doing a stability test and carefully documenting the color before and after, and you may be having, I know most people don't have Munsell chips, but if you can take a photo or something or keep in your mind the color of the stone before and after, because that's actually very important. It's going to take several hours to do the stability test. You have to remember exactly how the stone was before and after, and if you see any change in color, you need to be suspicious about what's happening there.
Well, thank you very much. We have another question.
Yes, do you know if the stability test can be made with shortwave UV? And can it be faster if it does work?
No, shortwave UV is not going to change the color of these stones. In particular, it's not going to take color out of these sapphires. So shortwave is not going to be a good option for that. You're mostly going to want to look at incandescent or daylight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There is another question. Wow, full of questions. This is what I like about gemology. Go ahead.
Was exactly the same question, but why short UV light is not effective to modify the color?
Most of these sapphires are actually pretty inert to shortwave UV. Okay, so if I'm going to get a little bit technical, when you're charging the stone up, it works best with a wavelength of about 360 nanometers, which is long wave UV. What you're actually doing is you're creating an electronic transition, and you're knocking an electron out to a trap. So you're creating this really unstable electronic configuration that ends up absorbing light pretty well. That's why you get this change in color. So you create this absorption band by kind of knocking this electron out. And the only way you can really get it back, I don't know if you've ever heard of like an activation energy. So like if you were to imagine an energy curve like this, you're basically creating this, this energy state that's up above the ground state, and it could roll downhill. You can also think of like a rock, right? Like a rock on a hill. If there's a little bump over the ledge, you've got to get over that little bump to get it to go all the way downhill. So to get it up to that state in the first place, you need to have a high energy, so shorter wavelengths. To get it to go back over that hill, you only need a very short amount of energy. You need a small amount of energy, so a longer wavelength. So a higher wavelength is not going to do it. You really need higher energy, lower wavelengths to get it up to this unstable state, and then lower energy, longer wavelengths to get it over that little activation energy, that little bump, to get it to roll downhill again. I don't know if that made sense. Okay.
There is another question. Vincent Pardieu, je vous en prie, monsieur. A microphone, please. Microphone.
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. If you take a sapphire and you irradiate it with shortwave UV, you're going to irradiate the sapphire. You are not going to fade test. If you use with shortwave UV, you take a colorless sapphire from Sri Lanka, Madagascar, Burma, the color will become yellow. And then the color will be unstable. Within a few hours, it will go. So you're going to irradiate the stone, not make a fade test. Any light that is more energy than visible light, you're going to irradiate your stone. That's it.
Yes. Is there any other questions,
One more.
ladies and gentlemen? There is one.
One more.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Aaron, that was brilliant. My question is just to clarify, what would be the treatment conclusion on the report, especially when you stabilize the color?
Right, so if we see a sapphire that changes color after the stability test, it does get a comment. I can't remember the exact nature, the exact wording, but it says basically this stone will change color with exposure to ultraviolet light. And it'll get that comment if it's a padparadscha or not a padparadscha, basically just saying that the color of the stone will change if you expose it to ultraviolet light. There's
Microphone.
It's going to be defined as irradiated on the report.
It doesn't, so there's no treatment comment that says irradiated. There's an additional comment that says this stone will change color with exposure to ultraviolet light. It doesn't, I suppose it doesn't technically cover other kinds of radiation like electron beam or gamma, but we don't really have good ways of differentiating those. And most of what we've seen is relatively like small changes in the color. Like we don't really see, like I showed that ruby, the stone I rated to a ruby and it brought back down to pink. Like we don't see those major changes in most cases. So most of what we see is like these very small changes in color that are most likely caused by kind of just artificial juicing with long wave UV.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that there are more questions in the room. You can find Aaron in the next few hours and also in the dinner tonight and tomorrow. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. Thank you very much, Aaron. Okay. What a lesson in gemology. Let me just go out of the photo frame.